Okay, good. We're going to talk about the Indian Revolt of 1857. I used to say, what was the most significant contributor to England's possession of India? And one of the options was pork grease. And people looked at it and they thought, that's all right, buddy. But it was the right answer. Anybody know what the Indian Revolt of 1857 was about?
Pork grease.
Well, what about?
Taxes on
No. It's Indian. Oh.
religious.
What about it? You're right. You know what the story is? You guys don't know this, I'll just tell you. We'll get to it. But one of the processes of modern states, and this is something I've talked about the whole semester, maybe I don't get into the details, but one of the things that makes a modern state is a standing professional army that uses scientific methods. The invention of gunpowder completely changes governments. Prior to the invention of gunpowder, you could have feudalism. If you go to Japan, you guys talked about the Japanese feudal era was kind of like European feudalism, right? You had knights, the samurais were kind of like knights. But this isn't uncommon. We saw something similar to this even back in Alexander's day or in the Assyrians. You had certain generals, certain soldiers that were different from the rest because of their equipment. They either had horses, they were able to work, fight on the horses, they had people supporting them. You look at Genghis Khan, the Mongols, the reason why they're so powerful is that they were actually able to be on their horses and fighting without ever missing a beat. So they were significantly better equipped than anybody that they were going against. Not just the equipment, but their skill level. Again, if you think about it, all they did was ride horses. In the knights, that's all that they did. They had other people working the fields. The samurais, that's all they did. So it's kind of a special class of folks that largely is based on skill set, right? You have to be good to be a soldier like that. And what does gunpowder do? You don't need the same skills. You just need to fire and shoot. So it creates a standing army. You don't have to collect all the good soldiers and have them be your captains and lieutenants. You can get anybody, any of the peasants, right? And you just train them. And you train them well with weapons, and that is a formidable force. Because it's not the person that's shooting, it's the weapon that's shooting. It makes a big difference. This is what transforms not only European modern nation states, but it transforms kind of modern nation states all around the world. In England, it's got this cultural diffusion in its process of colonization. England is not going to be shipping over information about how to build a factory in their colonies. Why not? You know the answer to this, even if you haven't actually thought it through. Why do they not want to build factories in India?
Because then India will get their knowledge.
Oh, yes.
Wouldn't make them want to not be a colony anymore?
Yeah, mercantilism is about getting more gold in than goes out. So you buy the raw materials cheaply. You bring it home. You turn them into finished products at home. Then you sell the same finished materials not only to your colonies but elsewhere in the world. If we have factories in India, then what happens to that equation? You don't, and why would they sell you the raw materials? They'll just keep the raw materials. So you don't get to buy the raw materials cheaply, and they're not going to buy the finished products because they can produce it there. And not only that, what would be worse of all? What if they started selling their finished products to their neighbors? Isn't this kind of exactly what happened in the United States? Isn't that exactly what the British were upset about? Is that we were trading with the French, we were trading with everybody else. They want us to be controlled. In the mercantilist empire, the colonies are supposed to serve the mother country. Now, one of the ways that they did that is that they had a minimal impact as much as they could on the local colonies. So you don't produce factories there. On the other hand, they also had this need for pacification. Remember, I kept using that term. What does pacification mean? To make peace. To make peace. Wherever their trading ports are, you want it to be a peaceful port. Because if it's constantly fighting, you're not going to be able to trade, you're not going to be able to get the raw materials, it's going to be more money. And you'd actually have to send some of your troops there to crush it. You don't want to do that if you can. So the solution, we can send military technology. That's relatively cheap. And because of gunpowder and whatnot, all we have to do is train the Indians. Give them weapons, they can do this on their own. And so they had very specific training protocols. I don't know if you've ever seen the old-fashioned, everyone's standing in line, they got their rifle at their side, with 3 steps to put on your shoulder, another step to put on the shoulder. Well, they had the other one where you put it in the front, and in order to load this, it's not a breech load gun. It's a musket. It's a barrel, a front end loader, muzzle loader. So you got to put in the powder. You got to put in the wadding. You got to put in the ball. No more wadding. Stamp, stamp. Well, this they had down to an absolute art. So basically, this hand. Take this hand. Put it in your pocket. Bite off the top. Push it in here. Put it back in your pocket. Stuff in the ball. Pump, pump, pump. Like 19 different steps. And they would do this because it was super easy. All you're teaching the Indians is how to do the steps. When they have a loaded gun, pick it up, aim, fire. Boom! You wait for the captain to do this. Well, part of these steps was that they had this packet where the gunpowder, this is 57. And I don't know if you know anything about weapons technology, but breech-loaded weapons are in about the next 10 years. Needle guns were around 57. You don't know this, but a needle gun just means a breech means you put it in the back end, put the bullet in there, close it up, and fire it. The problem is they were terribly inaccurate and weren't very successful. So we didn't use them for another 10, 15 years. By the 1870s, we have cartridges. We just put the cartridge in, you fire, boom. Not in the 50s. So this is about the best you can get for muskets, for muzzle loaders. So one of the things that they're supposed to do is you have this little packet that's already got the gunpowder in it, and it's already greased. Because if you think about it, the ball goes in there, it's got to be greased. What grease do they use? Pork grease. So what they're doing is they're telling everybody, take this, put it in your mouth, bite off the end, stuff it in, pour, 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 put it in there, stomp, 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 ready to go. Well, what they end up doing is you put a little bit of that pork grease in your mouth. It's part of the process. It's in the steps. They're teaching all these. Why is this a problem? You what? And who is the they? And you're correct. The Indians and? Because remember, in India isn't just Hindu, right? Who is in India? Muslims, right? Because remember, Genghis Khan comes over this way. And then also the Middle Eastern folks are coming this way. So you have Muslims here, and you also have Hindus. Why don't Hindus like pork?
Because one of their gods.
Kind of. What's the theory behind this? For Hinduism. You should know this as a religious belief. Reincarnation. We never spoke a lot about Hinduism. I always felt bad about that. Let me go ahead and spend it today. We know reincarnation. We talked about this with Buddhism. Hinduism is totally, it's a political religion. So they had, in the 1200s BC, you had these Aryans coming into this side of India, where the Ganges River is. And they were conquering the people that were already there. And one of the ways that they kind of kept this in place is that they created an extraordinarily hierarchical society. You have hierarchies everywhere. A caste system is when the social hierarchies are fixed. Make sure you understand this spelling. I know you guys have heard this somewhere in your world history when you're in high school. A caste system. It's like a class, but it's fixed. Class system, unfortunately today you guys don't understand what that means because we use the word all the time. Middle class, lower class. It's totally meaningless. Back in the 1600s, you used to have certifications if you were a nobility. It was like having your own papers. That's what it meant by class. I mean, it wasn't something where there's wealthy is upper class. Because you could be super wealthy and not be upper class. Because it was very specifically related to your family lineage. Well, we don't have that today. Today we think of class just those people that are a little bit higher, those people a little bit lower. In actual fact, almost everybody you know are in the same middle class. You know, some people a little higher, some people lower. Remove what you know and throw it away for a second. Go back into a more unequal time. Caste means that whatever social position you're in, you are there forever. You do never change. And if you can understand this from a political perspective, the Aryans came in and they took over. That means that everybody below were always going to be below. This is where the concept of reincarnation comes from. Again, this is a theological thing where most people, they just don't know this. We assume, well, reincarnation is what old archaic religions believe in, like the Native Americans believe in reincarnation. No, they didn't. No reincarnation in Greece, no reincarnation in Mesopotamia, no reincarnation in Egypt, no reincarnation in the Celtics. Reincarnation is uniquely Indian. It starts there. It spreads to China and Asia through Buddhism, which we did talk about. Buddhism, the idea that all life is suffering, you just have to get rid of life. Nirvana is when you blow out, you extinguish your life. That's your escape. Well, Hindu is where it starts from. Hinduism is the base. And reincarnation is just a political explanation. If you are here, then you are going to always be there. And the only way you get out is you die. If you don't believe in reincarnation, that argument doesn't sell very well. Right? You're going to always be on the poop scooper until you die. And then that's it, right? People think that's unfair. But if you argue reincarnation, you'll die. And if you do this well, you'll come up to a higher caste, right? And if you try to remove me from my superior position, you will then come down as a lower caste. That's the basic theory of Hinduism. Now, it's animism. We talked about this. Animism means that there's not just a few gods. We're talking millions of gods that are location specific. So there's a God that actually lives here. We don't have this concept of an omniscient God that knows everything. They are very specifically located. Some are more powerful than others. That's why I always tell you to think in terms of demons and angels, of actual spirits that have a physical existence somewhere, a physical place somewhere. And in Hinduism, that's what it is. But animism means that some of these spirits actually inhabit physical objects. So the hearth, or the doorway, or the bedpost, or someplace like that. So Hinduism combines the animism, the polytheism, and then it just adds reincarnation. So Hindus do not eat meat. Why is that?
Is that going to be their uncle?
Because if you're bad, you get out of the human life form. Now the way this works is that if you're really good, where are you going to go? You could be a deity. You could become a god. And even gods can become higher gods. So reincarnation is constant. You can understand why Buddhism did not succeed in India. Someone tell me why this doesn't work. Go ahead.
If you assume Buddhism is the right way, just a side question. When you blow out the Bible, so to speak, you don't reincarnate, right? That's the end.
That's it.
Okay, so if you did that, and let's say you're on the bottom of the pyramid, that's all you have, so why would you hasten yourself to die?
That's right. And it's even more than that. If all life is suffering, then it doesn't matter if you're on the high end or on the low end. All life is suffering. Everyone is deceived. So the only way you can escape it is to try to blow out and cease to exist. For Hinduism, eventually, if you get up high enough, you can be part of what this is called the Ahisma. It's kind of like soul, but there's like a universal soul. You still lose your identity, because if you think about it with reincarnation, what is your identity? You know, I come back as something, I don't remember what I was before. So you kind of lose any sense of identity, and you become part of this kind of universal soul. That's Hinduism. So there is some reward eventually. You don't cease to exist. But this is kind of the plus and minus system. Buddhism says it's all a big lie. Because remember, Buddhism is kind of atheist. Your goal is to get out of this life. And so, how would that affect your political structure? Fundamentally, is there a difference between the higher and the lower in Buddhism? No. And so fundamentally, is there any opposition to killing the guy who's up top? He is not authorized to be mean to you because he's done something better in a good life before him. Everybody is suffering. Everybody is equally in problems. And so if he is unjust to you, then you are justified in responding back. This totally does not work in India. So Buddhism, sorry. Even though, where does Buddhism begin? In India, out there by Tibet region. It's up this section of India. But that's where it starts. It shifts into China. It doesn't succeed in India. Because in India, Hinduism is political. Now there is another religion, though, that comes into India. It doesn't seem to have the same problem with this. What is the religion? Islam. Do you remember talking about Islam? What is the fundamental principles of Islam?
That God's law is above man.
That's it. I mean, if you were to reduce it down to anything else, total submission to God. That would be probably the best mission of Islam. Now, they don't particularly have any hierarchies, but on the other hand, they're not at all opposed to hierarchy. Because one of the things of total submission of God is that God's law is above tribal law. And if this guy is speaking for God, then you do not question him. And so if you come in and you're Islamic and you're living up on this side, right? And these guys who may not be Islamic, they may all be Hindu. What have they been taught from Hinduism to do to the people that are above them?
Leave them alone.
Leave them alone. Respect them. Do whatever they say, right? And for the Muslims, what have they been taught? If you're not Muslim, it's like you're dead man walking, right? You're not. Did I mention this? Oh, maybe I should. Good.
In the Quran, does it say they have, like, their goal is to, like, change the people that aren't Muslim?
No. They're just, this is the way of God. You either follow it or you don't. If you don't follow it, you are outside of God. And so your heaven starts right here on earth. If you don't follow it, you don't have free will. So you've already removed yourself from God. So there's no change. It doesn't mean that you can't convert, but if you do, it's because God wanted you to. If you don't, dead man walking. You're already hell. You're already dead. This is the whole concept of the suicide bomber idea and the jihad, because all these people are infidels. Now, there are some extent, we'll talk about this in a second, there's some theological disagreement that comes up in the 1800s. But basically, if you believe that anyone who's not Muslim doesn't have that same right, then do you have any problem with a caste system? If you're Muslim and you're at the top of the caste, would you have a problem? Now, you might have a problem if you're at the bottom of the caste. But if you're at the top, no problem at all. And so that's why you can see you have both. Well, what do Muslims have a problem with? What do Muslims have with pork fat?
Fasting.
Yeah, it's hard. You guys don't know this. I didn't tell you. I'll tell you now. Islam comes out of Christianity and Judaism. I thought I told you about this. So they believe that there's like 7 main prophets. And Jesus was not God, he was a prophet. And so Muhammad was the last prophet. And so what he did is he completed what was revealed. So everybody reveals a little bit. Abraham reveals a little bit. Moses reveals a little bit. Noah, you've got key guys that they reveal a little bit to the world. And then the very last one was Muhammad, who reveals the last bit. Now you have to understand, of course, why do they believe this? If they believe that Jesus was God, then there's nothing more. You can't have another revelation. Now, Mohammedans actually believe in Easter that Jesus died and resurrected. But they don't believe he was the Son of God. He was just a prophet. He was giving one more type of revelation. So that when Muhammad comes, he also gives one more type of revelation. So why does this matter to us? Because in all of the beliefs that the Jews had and the Christians had are somehow compatible with the Quran. If you read the Quran, they talk about Jesus and Mary in there. They talk about Abraham. They're all kind of part of it. So what's with the pork?
Isn't there like a kosher thing?
Yes, there's totally a kosher thing. Absolutely there's a kosher thing. In Exodus and Deuteronomy, when you're talking about the clean animals and the unclean animals, you guys don't know this, but it says very clearly it has to chew its cud and have cloven hoofs. And so pigs were always seen as unclean animals. They have cloven hooves, but what don't they have? They don't chew their cud, so that's why they're unclean. And so pork has always been considered unclean in the Middle Eastern areas. And so Islam looked at pork as being unclean. So here we have two sides, whether you're Hindu or Muslim, it doesn't matter which. Both of these guys are going to be upset that you're sticking pork fat in your mouth, right? Now, what is the British concern? Do they have any knowledge of this? No, it's not money. It's why are they training these soldiers to do this? What's the advantage that gunpowder has that the Middle Ages did not have?
It's easier to train.
It's just easy to train. Remember, the knights had to be trained. That's all they did. The samurai, that's all they did. If you're looking at old-fashioned military, you have to cultivate the really good soldiers. But with gunpowder, you just have to train them how to load and fire the weapon. And all they do is have systematic 19-point. You can have the dumbest Indian in the world. You can have the smartest. It doesn't matter. They all do exactly the same. And so they create this, not for India. This is the same method they use all over the British Empire. And so it's happening to be in India. And for some reason, the Indians don't want to do this. And the English, they're not stupid, but they just don't understand. Why don't you guys want to do that? It's not until these British folks say, you do this, what are you doing? You're supposed to be doing this. And then there's a rebellion. And the rebellion was that they thought, and remember, the Hindus, with reincarnation, the caste system, they are not prone to rebellion. Their whole culture is anti-rebellion. Except when you do something that goes against their massive cultural norm. No pork, no animal fat, and you tell them to stick both of them in their mouth. It's only after the rebellion that the British realized, no, we don't have to do this. And they came up with a different non-animal-based fat in order to train them. But the reaction was that it created a rebellion. And so what do you do with a rebellion? You put more troops in there and you quash it. And as a result, they basically took over India and made it a protectorate. Later, they realized we can't do this anymore. Does this make sense? So pork fat has a key factor. But at the same time, it says a lot about the process of colonization. But at the same time, it says a lot about the process of colonization. This isn't bigotry. It's hard for people to get this sometimes. But you have the British homeland, right? And they are an empire. And it's based off of mercantilism. And mercantilism is money. But it's not all about money. After the American Revolution, it wasn't about money. What it's about is stability. This is the mommy land, right? And then you have colonies all over the world. And you have to realize that England isn't a dictatorship. So who's making the actual money for the most part? Today, the United States has interests all over the world, but is the government Walmart? Walmart isn't owned by the government. What does the government get when Walmart does really successful? Taxes. That's it, right? But does the government want Walmart to be really successful? What also does it get? What also does it get? It gets employment. It gets lots of people to get paid. Those people then take their money and they pay for other things. And so there is a certain interest in having a strong economy. So the government doesn't have to own these businesses in order for you to have a strong economy. It's in your interest to make it easy for the economy to grow. This is not just money. So when England has interests all over the world, it's because there's private businesses, firms that have an interest in these colonies. And they're going to pay taxes to the crown, they're going to employ people. This will help the English government. So it's a little bit more complex. It's not just money, it's about kind of empire. Now, the reason why I say this is going to be confusing, because there is a hierarchy. These guys are presumed to be the source of success. And so when you are at the homeland here, you have the British, either the governor or the military, whoever who is establishing order. And whether you tell them or not, what is everybody who's indigenous, the locals, where do they fit in this order? It doesn't have to be racist. It doesn't have to be white, black. But it's totally knowledge-based. The English have a very sophisticated political and economic system. And what about these guys that they're taking over? And before you get too far, what happens if they had an equally sophisticated political and economic system?
They'd be just as strong.
Would England be able to colonize them?
No.
No, right? It's the whole point. They are colonized because they don't have a sophisticated corporate knowledge system of economics and politics. So automatically there's a hierarchy. The English are coming in above. And with pacification, why do the English see that they're there? What's the justification for them being there?
To create order.
Yeah, because if they're not there, what's going to happen? Because the people don't have order. Now this sounds horribly patronizing. I have to be there because the kids are going to run racket if I'm not there. It sounds horribly patronizing, but what's the reality?
There's truth.
Because it's not just a state. This is a modern mercantilist empire state. It's a much more sophisticated system. And so they wouldn't have it in India. It wouldn't be in the Middle East. It wouldn't be in Africa. It wouldn't be in these other places. You are bringing this fairly sophisticated corporate knowledge system somewhere else. And so, yes, these guys are at the higher end. And they're teaching. And yes, are they going to have a patronizing attitude? Totally. And if you're the soldier coming in, and you know that your job is to keep peace, because if you're not there, they're going to run racket, then it gets reinforced. What is thuggee? And you guys know thuggee because you say, look at that thug over there. You guys know, remember? Thuggee. It's Indian. It's a religious ceremony. One of the gods in India gets satisfaction through violence. And so thuggee was when a group of people would come in and then just beat somebody to death. It was a ceremonial thing. You did it for religious things, right? Well, if you are British, sophisticated, right? If you are civilized and you see thuggee, what is your reaction? They're animals, right? They're animals. So you have to stop them from doing that. They don't understand. What about sete? S-E-T-T-E-E. You guys ever heard of sete? Sete was a practice of when the man died, his wife would sit on top of his body and be burned to death with him in cremation. Because she does, Linda is like, I don't think this is what I want to do. You are the possession of the man, and so when he dies, his things go with him, so the woman goes with him. Sete, and the thing is, it wasn't always forced. The women did this. So when the British comes into this village and see them burning this woman alive, are we horrified by this? Of course we're horrified by this. Now let's be honest. If we were completely diversity folks, totally culturally aware, politically sensitive, right? You get this in your books when we were talking about the Europeans taking over South America. One of the first things that they complain about is that the Christian missionaries were converting people. Now, how horrible was this? Well, if you're completely politically correct and say, that's what India does, and aren't you being intolerant to prevent them from doing this? And what's the British response? It's grotesque. You are violating people's rights. You're killing people. I don't care if it's a religious thing or not. You don't kill people. So you can see where this conflict comes in. And so you can look at this and you can say, well, you know, the English were patronizing. They were patriarchal. You know, they thought they were higher and superior to the colonists. Yes, they did. But why? It's true. They weren't being tolerant. It's true.
Question.
Yes.
Are they tolerant about most things except for things that they love?
Yes. That's the real trick. It's not because they hate black people or they hate non-colored people or whatever it is. It was in civilization, this is what you do. Yes, they're Christian. And yes, they believe in human life, and they thought that the Indians were barbaric. But let's be honest, if you were sitting there and you saw a woman being burned to death, would you not have the same feelings? Yes, you would, right? It isn't politically correct. It wasn't tolerant, but it wasn't necessarily just a matter of bigotry. You're dealing with two separate levels of corporate knowledge, and you cannot understand world history without recognizing that the corporate knowledge is not only technology, which is clearly there, but there's also political and social convictions that go with it. In our modern society, we assume everyone has human rights, that they're born with human rights. This isn't a technology, and yet it is clearly a byproduct of Western civilization. It's a part of our corporate knowledge base. We also have cultural identity. And for us, the idea that a woman is going to be burned alive with her husband is abhorrent to that. Then there's also the practice of cultural diffusion. And as you know, when you have two corporate knowledge bases, and the more cultural diffusion you bring about, it's going to increase your corporate knowledge. It's also going to change the cultural identity. And we can look at this and we can lament it and say it's the worst thing in the world, or we can recognize that it's inevitable. This is what's happening with colonization. It's not a simple situation where the British are wrong and the Indians are right. The British are wrong, the Africans are right. The British are wrong, the Asians are right. You're dealing with two separate corporate knowledge bases. So here's the great big British one, and then here is wherever else we're at, in India. And India's corporate knowledge base is not the same. As a result of cultural diffusion, they share similarities over time, more and more. But as they do that, then the cultural identity changes. Not just with India, but with Africa, African countries, with certain Asian countries. This is the part of colonization. Now we're going to end this unit next week. What's the very last thing? What do we see in the 20th century, coming into the 21st century?
Decolonization.
Yeah, decolonization, because we don't want to be that guy who is imposing that order on everybody below. Because even though you know that it's a good thing, you are the one that has to do it. And as these people become more and more, have more and more cultural diffusion, which means their own corporate knowledge base increases, they are becoming less and less willing to be below. That's why you have revolutions. Sometimes very, very violent ones. Sometimes quite peaceful. In India, the transfer of power, totally peaceful. England just left. Of course, as soon as they left, what happened?
Civil War is
Instant civil war. Instant civil war. England just left, boom! Civil war for 4 years. Very bloody. Because it was the English who were pacifying India. That's why they were peaceful. As soon as they left, India had to take care of it. And they did not have the same corporate knowledge base. Now, if I'm going to be politically correct, what I'll say is they didn't, because this corporate knowledge base was largely Western. It reflected Western English Christian ideals. And India isn't Western, isn't Christian. It's got reincarnation. It has a caste system. It's got all sorts of other legacies. So they had to create their own government. So their government looked a little bit like the West, but then it wasn't. This isn't unique to India. We're going to see this in Africa. We're going to see this in Asia. One of the points I'm trying to make here is that this isn't a yes or no answer. It's not these guys are right and those guys are wrong. It's a corporate knowledge issue. Let me give you some details. We have 20 minutes. You guys have a million keywords. And last time I said, figure it out. You guys are smart. I give you big ideas. You take the text. I'm still going to say that. But fortunately, we're just a little bit ahead. So I'm going to take some moment to make sure you understand certain key, detailed concepts. So if you're not taking notes, this is the time to make sure you take notes. The concepts are still the same. Themes are still the same. I'm going to give you a little bit more storyline. So let's make sure you understand this. Okay, first of all, I talked about Islam. You should know that there are 5 pillars of Islam. What does that mean, 5 pillars of Islam?
Like 5.
Yeah, the basic, they're the foundations of their belief. Go ahead.
The profession of faith,
Yes.
prayer,
Yes.
fasting,
Yes.
almsgiving,
Yes.
and pilgrimage.
Perfect. Yes. Okay. Why does that matter? All of them, if you look at all of them, they basically boil down to total submission to God. And each of them kind of are reflecting that concept. Total submission to God, one monotheism. But you should know this. I give you the details. You know this. You should know what the 5 pillars are. You should know the divisions of Islam. What happened? And I mentioned this real briefly. Good.
Wasn't it after Muhammad died?
Immediately after he dies. Exactly. And what was the big divisions? Do you remember?
Between Muhammad's son and Muhammad's chosen.
That's right. Which was which?
Muhammad chose somebody to lead after him.
Okay, so the key divisions.
Isn't there the Shia and the Shia?
Yes. And this is where you're going to have to remember. So you have, and you see, and you hear this even today, right? This isn't new. Shia and Sunni. Which one is which?
Shia is Muhammad's son.
Yes. Shia, blood. And Sunni is, I was going to say merit, but I don't know if I should say that. But definitely, I'll go ahead and say that, even though the Shia Muslims would hate that. Right? How does that affect Islam? We talked about this. You may not have caught it, but we were talking about the difference between the rigidity of the faith and the centralization of the politics. Remember that? If you are really centralized politically, what's going to happen to your faith? Is it? Why? This is the basis of order. Think of that. Think pacification, right? Basis of order. If we are already ordered through politics, then do we need to have a super fanatically strong religion? No, because we have the politics. But what if we are weak in our politics? Then we need to have a very strong religion. That's exactly what it is. So you can see where there's a tie. That's the reason why I talked about this. Well, which is which? Which one is going to be a little bit more particular than the other? Let me rephrase this. Which one is going to tend to be in a more politically unified region?
The merit.
Yes, that's it. Soon. And so this is going to have tighter politics, which means that the religion Even though it's still Islam, right? But it's not as you might think fundamental. In Shia, it's usually when there are more fragmented. So think of tribalism, right? In that case, you need to have a much more rigid religion, fundamentalists. There are doctrinal differences. I don't want to get into it. The Shia believe that there is another prophet out there, not the level of Muhammad. You call the 13th Imam, that he's a leader, that he hasn't died, he's still out there. And when he comes back, then he'll kind of fix everything, and he'll get rid of all the Sunni. You can see where this could lead to some pretty big wars, right? Because if you're getting rid of all the Sunni, what does that say about you?
You don't like this.
That's right. Remember, Islam is a theocracy. There's no division between your faith and religion. Christianity is not. Christianity has separation of church and state, not Islam. And part of it has to do with there being no free will. So what God's will is has to be on earth just as much as on heaven. And it goes back to the origins of Islam. God's law above human law. So if God's law above human law, how could it be anything but a theocracy? That means human law must follow God's law. It has to be a theocracy. You don't have this in the West. And so that's where you can see kind of this differences. Well, if you're not following this particular brand, then you are not quite dead man walking, but kind of, right? You are not part of Islam. So this is where you can have huge wars. So you should know the difference between Shia and Sunni. What is a Sufi? It's not the same kind of extreme. We don't say 1, 2, 3, 4 on either sides. Did anybody happen to know what the Sufi are? They're the mystics. They're in all over. There's no particular region. They tend to be in places where they're more rural. But a mystic, where they think of kind of almost like magic is mysticism, right? So there's they have a connection between God and man. And so you can find Sufis everywhere, but they're usually individual and they're small little groups. And they have different types of practices. They're still Islamic, but they just tend to be a little bit different, usually much more peaceful. What about the Kharijites? These you guys need to know. One example of Kharijites would be the Wahhabists. If you know Kharijite, you don't need to know about Wahhabists because they're kind of the same. It's a kind of Kharijite. What is Kharijite? Ultra-Orthodox, ultra-rigid. These are basically your suicide bombers. Now, let's put it this way. If there is no separation between church and state, right, and you're absolutely rigid, and your rigidity is basically based on the fact that there's not a strong politics, and the Kharijites are almost always trying to impose what? On the order that they're in, the little region that they're in. Yes, strong political order. This is why it's kind of confusing to understand the Middle East. Part of it is theological, most of it is very political. Well, it's hard when they're combined. In a theocracy, how do you separate the politics from the theocracy? So if you're extremely rigid, if you're in an area that's got kind of chaotic political, then these religious extremists are going to be saying, this is the solution. You follow us, we will impose order, God's will be done. The Kharijites. These date back until the 12th, 13th, 14th century. They become significant in terms of British colonialism. Even though you remember that the British don't set up colonies in the Middle East. What are the Kharijites going to think about the British having any presence in the Middle East? Yeah, the infidels coming over. So they're the ones that are unhappy. They're the same ones that are unhappy about American presence or British presence or any of the Allied presence or any Christian presence. So if we know this, what does this say about, say, Saudi Arabia? Where do they generally fit? It's a good question. So how about not Saudi Arabia? How about we look at Dubai? Arab Emirates, right? Sunni. Why Sunni?
They're based
Do they want infidels to come to their country? Yeah, the largest building in the world. It's like a playground for super, super wealthy people. They're big on having international commerce. They're making gobs of money out of it, yes.
What do you mean by the term infidel? Is that just kind of like a basic of like someone who doesn't
Believe in Islam.
Islam?
That's what it means. Yeah. Just general, it's like an unbeliever. So the Arab Emirates would be Sunni. But what if you're not necessarily in power? What could you be? Because remember, the Arab Emirates, as well as Saudi Arabia, it's a ruling family, one tribe. What if you're not part of that tribe? Or what if you're a lesser guy in that tribe? What might be tempting to you? Well, Shia or Kharijites. Right? Because you see that the politics isn't strong enough. It's not strong enough because you're not in it, right? And that's where you can see the Arab Dubai might be strongly Western, but you have a couple of these people that are kind of disenfranchised, and this is their opportunity to kind of shape the system. And they could use a religious tool to do that. Well, this exists today in 2016. It also existed at the time when there was more British influence. The only difference is that today that the ruling tribes have billions of dollars because of oil. What happens pre-oil? They don't. They have hardly any resources. And so there's that natural dominance of the colonial government having influence on the locals. And the British do not want to rule sand, have no interest. What's the only reason why the British get involved with Middle East?
Because they want part of the spice trade.
No. They want the Suez Canal open. That's it. The only reason why England got there at all was that Napoleon went over and took over England in 1790. And so who's fighting Napoleon? England. And what does England not want to control that region? Doesn't want it in France. Kick out Napoleon. And so England's got a hold over this region. Not as a governor, not as a colony, but just because they don't want France there, and then eventually they're not going to want Russia there, because Russia here on the Black Sea would love to also dominate this area. So it really has nothing to do with oil. There's no oil there in the 1890s, 1900, 1920. It has to do with strategic concern. They could care less about the resources because there's nothing there. They're not going to make any money there. And not only they, because England, remember, they're not making the money in the colonies. It's these private firms. The private firms aren't making any money. India, they make money. Asia, they make money because they've got lots of trade. Middle East, hardly anything. But it's not for money that gets them to go there. Make sense? Okay. You guys understand religious divisions? Ottoman, okay, let's make sure I use these terms. I don't know if you got this. Ottoman basically is modern Turkey. At one time, they took over Greece. Today, I don't know if you know this, but the Turks and the Greeks don't get along. Why? It's a really easy answer. Because at one time, they took over Greece. So the Greeks still hate the Turks for having taken them over. Now, in the 20th century, this Ottoman Empire is going to be pushed back because it just cannot compete with modern technology of Europe. Greece will open up. Russia will be pushing in. Austria will be pushing in. Why does it matter to us that the Ottomans are going to lose some of this power? That means that you're going to have a power vacuum there. Why is this a big deal in 1914? That's how World War I starts. Russia wants to own this. The Ottomans don't, the Austrians want to own this. They don't want the Russians. The Ottomans don't want the Russians. They don't really want the Austrians. That's why this is a big deal. But prior, in 1450, they own it. They're slowly going to be pushed back. That's the Ottomans. They also have Egypt, but they're going to lose that control as well. They also have North Africa. They're going to lose that control. The Muslims are going to be pushed out of Spain. So the Ottomans are the most Western because they're the closest to Europe. After that, on the other side, by where Iran and Iraq, that's the Safavid. This has got the least political power. So what religion are they going to be mostly? Shia. Ottomans will be Sunni. Safavid, Shia. What about Khanates? The Khanates are the ones that are in India. They have more of a political organization, not not central necessarily, but there's more of a political organization, mainly because of the caste system, right? Hindu? Yeah, the caste system. And so Hindus and Muslims are living side by side here. They fight each other, but they don't have to worry about the people. So because of that political stability, there tends to be the religion there? Sunni and Sufi mysticism. Exactly. That makes sense? Okay. You guys are smart.
So, side question.
Yes.
We are allies, like right now, with one of them, Shia or Sunni, correct?
Well, we tend to do better with Sunni because they tend to be more open to westernization.
So we're fighting Shia.
But sometimes, this is a friend of my friend, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend thing. So we are on either side sometimes. The West is on either side. And it depends. Sometimes the Shia will be supportive of having some support against the Sunni. This is kind of that whole concept of colonization. But in modern day, we don't do colonization. Yet we're really interested in pacification. Just because we don't colonize doesn't mean that we don't want to keep things at peace. Prior to World War II, the main process of pacification was colonization. After World War II, you can't use colonization because what we talked about, the Atlantic Charter, we can't have colonies. But we still want pacification. What's the main method of pacification today? And the United States is big on this, but so are some of the European countries. Money. We just pour money, foreign aid. Give them gobs and gobs of money and hope that they'll use the money to build whatever infrastructure they can in order to calm pacification. Does it always work? No. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they rebel. Sometimes they'll have their own revolution. Iraq becomes more Kharijite. Iran is more of a Kharijite than Sunni or Shiite. They're more on the extreme side, right? Yet we were helping them because we wanted pacification. Well, now, of course, we can't. When they overthrew the government, prior to the revolution in '79, the Iranian government was mostly kind of pro-Western. Then they got thrown out. This is because the Middle East does not have yet that corporate knowledge base that has the same stability that Western countries have. Not yet. Now, what will happen in 100 years? They will. Cultural diffusion is inevitable. It's inevitable. It'll be something else. If you remember, the Baltics, Eastern Europe, constantly fighting. Germany and Russia, France fighting for centuries. What are they now? And how long has it been?
Almost 100 years.
Yeah. Yes, you had to have a huge big war with World War II, but now it's not, right? And then you had the Cold War, but now it's not. So things do change. Cultural diffusion is inevitable. It just takes time. 5 more minutes. You guys understand the process of colonization in... let me give you some other names you don't know. These guys. Cultural diffusion is inevitable. By the 1800s, Muslim intellectuals began to kind of change a little bit. So, Jamal al-Din Afghani is from basically this Afghanistan area, India mainly. And his idea is pan-Islam. Pan-Islam. Whenever you say pan something, it means put everything together. Pan, everything together. So he was trying to come up with an idea of Islam that was combined. No Shia, no Sunni, no Sufi, just everything. It's like an Indian nationalism. Was this a Western idea or a non-Western idea? It's a Western idea. It is a Western idea. It's a concept of a strong nation state. Didn't succeed, but what you can see is clearly it's an influenced by the West. Muhammad Abduh, he was trying to argue that the Quran has no problem with science. And so Muslims should embrace science, scientific technology. Is this a Western idea or a non-Western idea? It's totally Western. And last, Muhammad Iqbal, he was thinking about Islam not as being rigidly specific, like you have to believe that the Quran is exactly literal. You could be kind of more abstract. Where does he get these ideas from? From the West. So even Islam is being influenced by Western ideals. Not all of them are successful. Although I'll tell you, in Turkey today, You've got lots of Muslims who say, Christ is in the Quran and Judaism is in there. There's no reason why we should be fighting each other. We should be literally respecting. Totally anti-infidel concept, totally anti-jihadist. That's why you have lots of Muslims who look at some of the crazy terrorists and they're totally embarrassed by it because they said, that's not us. And yet the terrorist folks are going to say, no, this is us, and you guys are all not part of it. But the Western influence changes. Cultural diffusion is inevitable. Last minute here. Let me give you another similar thing with India. I told you Hinduism, caste system, I talked about this. Let me really talk about, and I told you about the animal grease, the bullets revolt in 1857. This one, Ram Mohan Roy. If you've ever studied Hinduism back when you were in high school, comparative world religion, almost always they'll talk about the three main gods. And they'll talk about reincarnation and this idea of going into the global order. This is not Hinduism. Never has been Hinduism. This is the byproduct of Ram Mohan Roy. If you look at that, late 1700s, early 1800s. He went to Oxford. He's Indian. He went to Oxford. He gets people explain what is Hinduism and how can you explain animism to someone who doesn't get it. How can you explain polytheism? Not polytheism like big gods, but polytheism like you really believe the gods are everywhere. It's hard to explain. Instead of explaining all the time, he's kind of embarrassed by it. How do you explain Thuggee and Seti and all that type of stuff? You don't. So what he did is he kind of articulated, he translated Hinduism in a way that Christianity could understand. So why did he choose three main gods? Because it's the Trinity. Absolutely. There's no coincidence here. And so he's trying to say, well, Hinduism is very similar to Christianity. We just have three main gods, but they're kind of similar. We talk about peace and love and charity and all these things. And so he's taking Christian ideals and he's putting it on to Hinduism. The thing is that if you're down at the lower castes and you talk about Ram Mohan Roy, they have no idea who he is and they have no understanding of three main gods. Because they are fundamentally animistic and polytheistic. None of that stuff fits. But if you're off in Oxford, you are already at the higher caste, you're already being influenced by the West, you don't care what the guy in the lower caste thinks. You are presenting what the intelligentsia of India thinks. Who is most influenced by Western teaching? The intelligentsia. When you talk to Gandhi, right? Gandhi says, we're all this, we're all that. Gandhi can say that. He's up in the high class, right? He's not going to be talking about Hinduism as the lowest caste is going to be talking about it. Because he is heavily influenced by Western ideology. Cultural diffusion is inevitable. It doesn't mean, though, that you get rid of your cultural identity. It doesn't mean that you get rid of your cultural identity. So whether you're in the Middle East, or whether you're in India, or whether you're off in one of these Asian spots, you're going to continue to be your own culture, but you will change and be influenced by this modern Western ideology. Questions? Comments? Words of wisdom? Okay, that's good. We'll talk about the exam on Tuesday, and by that, Wednesday, by the time I'll actually have recorded all your stuff and give them all